The avoidant crumbles when the super empath detaches emotionally. Have you ever noticed that the moment you finally stop trying to fix someone, the moment you stop chasing, explaining, or proving your worth, they suddenly show up? That's not coincidence. That's power shifting hands. Because when the super empath, the one who feels deeply, gives selflessly, and understands endlessly, finally goes quiet, the avoidance world starts to fall apart. For so long, the super empath believes love means understanding. They think, if I can just be patient enough, gentle enough, forgiving enough, maybe they'll finally meet me halfway. But here's what really happens. The avoidant learns to take comfort in your effort. They pull away, knowing you'll run after them. They stay silent, knowing you'll start the conversation. They withhold love, knowing you'll try harder to earn it. And slowly, you begin to shrink, not because you're weak, but because your love became a survival strategy. But then something shifts. One day, the super empath wakes up and realizes, I don't need to prove my value through someone else's avoidance. And that moment, that quiet, steady moment of emotional detachment, is when the entire dynamic changes. Because the avoidant feeds off control, they need to feel like they hold the emotional upper hand. So when the super empath stops reacting, stops chasing, and starts protecting their peace, the avoidant crumbles. They start to question everything. Why aren't you calling? Why aren't you fighting for this? Why aren't you giving me what I took for granted? That's not love returning. That's control slipping. And that's when you finally see the truth. Your detachment isn't punishment, it's self-respect. It's the moment you stop bleeding for someone who never intended to heal with you. When the super empath detaches emotionally, the game ends. Because love, real love, can only exist where two people meet each other halfway, not where one chases and the other hides. When the empath finally goes silent, it's not about revenge, indifference, or trying to make the avoidant miss them. It's about energy, where it flows, what it feeds, and how it defines connection. For so long, the empath has been conditioned to believe that love equals expression, that to care deeply means to always explain, reassure, prove, and reach out. Their silence feels unnatural at first, almost painful, like holding their breath underwater. But what they eventually discover is that silence is not absence. It's presence redefined. It's choosing not to waste emotional energy on someone who only listens when it benefits them. When the empath stops explaining, the avoidant loses their favorite form of control. Avoidant personalities often rely on the emotional labor of others to maintain the illusion of distance. They push away, expecting to be chased. They withdraw, expecting to be pursued. They misunderstand silence as apathy, but when it comes from the empath, it's something far more powerful. It's awareness. The empath's quiet is not cold, it's measured. It's the sound of boundaries forming where once there were none. For the first time, the empath is not reacting from pain. They're responding from clarity. They start to see that their constant communication wasn't connection, it was containment. It was trying to manage someone else's discomfort so they wouldn't feel abandoned. Every message, every apology, every attempt to talk things through was really an attempt to keep the relationship from falling apart. But what they didn't realize was that, in doing so, they were holding together something that was never meant to be sustained by one person's effort. When they finally stop, everything shifts. The avoidant feels it immediately. The dynamic that once gave them security, knowing they could disappear without consequence, suddenly dissolves. The empath's silence becomes unsettling. It challenges the avoidant's belief that they can dictate the pace of connection. Suddenly, they're no longer in control of the emotional temperature. The empath isn't chasing anymore. They're not explaining. They're not pleading for clarity. They're simply existing, and that stillness becomes deafening to the one who used to rely on their noise. Power shifts in that silence because attention is the most valuable currency in any relationship. When the empath stops spending theirs recklessly, they start accumulating self-worth. They begin to feel stronger, lighter, more anchored. They realize they don't need to scream to be heard. They don't need to give to prove they're enough. The avoidant may misinterpret this quiet as detachment, but it's actually the empath's return to equilibrium. It's the first time their emotional investment aligns with reciprocity instead of survival. What's fascinating is how the avoidant reacts. They might reach out suddenly, sensing the change but not understanding it. They may accuse the empath of being distant or uncaring, unaware that what they're really experiencing is the absence of control. The empath doesn't respond the way they used to. They're not desperate to fix things or restore comfort. They've learned that peace feels better than the constant anxiety of trying to hold on to someone who doesn't want to be held. In this space of silence, the empath begins to rebuild. They start redirecting all that energy, the overthinking, the emotional checking, the caretaking, back into themselves. They find calm where there used to be chaos. The power shift isn't about dominance, it's about balance. It's realizing that love can't survive in a space where one person is always reaching and the other is always retreating. The silence becomes sacred. It becomes a declaration of worth, a quiet statement that says, I will no longer abandon myself to keep someone else comfortable, and that's when everything changes. The empath doesn't need to speak to reclaim their power, their silence speaks for them. The avoidant can feel the difference, even if they can't name it. The very thing they feared, true emotional closeness, is now gone, not because the empath withheld it, but because they finally stopped offering it where it wasn't respected. In that stillness, the power dynamic flips completely, and the empath finally stands in their own peace, not waiting to be understood, but finally understanding themselves. The avoidant thrives on reaction. Every retreat they make, every wall they build, every sudden withdrawal, it all functions within a predictable emotional rhythm. They move back, expecting the empath to move forward. They create distance, expecting the empath to close it. It's not always intentional or malicious. It's simply how they've learned to manage connection. For the avoidant, closeness feels like danger. Emotional intimacy brings up old fears, the fear of being trapped, the fear of losing control, the fear of being seen too deeply. And so they push away, but they don't want to lose the bond entirely. They want to know that someone will still reach for them when they retreat. That's how they feel safe, not through closeness, but through control. The empath, on the other hand, is wired to close emotional gaps. They can sense disconnection like a drop in temperature. When the avoidant pulls back, the empath immediately goes into repair mode, trying to restore warmth, understanding, and reassurance. They overthink what they might have done wrong, send thoughtful messages, and offer comfort even when none is reciprocated. This reaction feeds the avoidance pattern. It confirms their unspoken belief that they can distance themselves without losing the relationship. The empath's pursuit becomes the avoidant's safety net, allowing them to remain emotionally detached while still feeling desired and secure. This cycle continues because both roles unconsciously reinforce each other. The empath believes love must be earned through effort, and the avoidant believes love must be managed through distance. Each plays their part perfectly until one day the empath stops reacting. That's when the pattern begins to unravel. When the empath no longer chases, explains, or fills the silence, the avoidant sense of control starts to crumble. They don't know what to do without the reassurance that someone will always be there waiting. Their identity in the relationship has depended on the predictability of the empath's response. When that predictability vanishes, anxiety replaces confidence. The avoidant begins to feel what the empath once felt: uncertainty, doubt, and the fear of loss. They start to question the connection they once took for granted. They replay conversations, test boundaries, and even attempt to provoke a reaction, anything to confirm that they still hold emotional significance. But the empath doesn't react the same way anymore. Their energy is no longer available for emotional rescue missions. Instead, it's redirected inward, toward peace, clarity, and healing. The power of detachment lies in disrupting emotional expectation. The avoidant no longer receives the soothing response they relied on to feel safe. They are left alone with the very discomfort they've spent their lives avoiding, their own emotions. The empath's silence forces them to confront what's underneath the avoidance, fear, insecurity, and the vulnerability they've never learned to manage. This moment of discomfort is the mirror they've been running from, and for the first time, there's no one else standing between them and the reflection. For the empath, breaking this cycle feels liberating but also strange. They've spent so long believing that their love had to be demonstrated through effort that stepping back feels unnatural. But as they resist the urge to react, they start to recognize how much power they've given away in the past. Every time they tried to fix, explain, or chase, they were teaching the avoidant that they didn't have to show up fully, that love would always meet them halfway, even if they only walked a quarter of the distance. By not reacting, the empath stops teaching that lesson. In this silence, the balance shifts. The avoidant can no longer depend on someone else to regulate the emotional tone of the relationship. The empath's detachment creates a vacuum that the avoidant doesn't know how to fill. And that's the beginning of change, not just for the empath, who is learning to honor their energy, but for the avoidant who is forced to face the consequences of their distance. Without reaction, avoidance loses its purpose. Without pursuit, withdrawal becomes isolation. The cycle breaks the moment one person decides not to play their role anymore. What once felt like a power dynamic is revealed for what it truly was: an imbalance of emotional responsibility. When the empath detaches, the avoidant can no longer sustain the illusion of control. They may crumble, they may reflect, or they may retreat even further. But either way, the pattern no longer owns the empath. The reaction that once kept the cycle alive is gone, replaced by stillness. And in that stillness, power quietly changes hands. Empathy is a gift, but when it exists without boundaries, it becomes a burden. The empath's natural instinct is to understand, to feel deeply, to connect on levels that others often cannot reach. They sense emotions before they are spoken, they absorb pain that isn't theirs, and they find purpose in easing the suffering of others. This depth of feeling is beautiful, but it's also dangerous when paired with someone who does not know how to value it. Without boundaries, empathy can transform from compassion into self-abandonment. The empath begins to pour endlessly into someone who only takes, and over time, that pouring becomes depletion. When an empath loves an avoidant, the imbalance becomes even more pronounced. The avoidant, who fears vulnerability and closeness, unconsciously draws comfort from the empath's constant reassurance. They don't have to risk openness or honesty because the empath fills in the gaps. The empath senses withdrawal and immediately compensates by giving more love, more patience, more understanding. What begins as a desire to connect turns into a desperate attempt to hold the relationship together. In their effort to make the avoidant feel safe, the empath forgets to make themselves feel safe. They begin to carry the emotional weight of two people, mistaking their exhaustion for devotion. Over time, this pattern distorts the empath's perception of love. They start believing that love is supposed to be hard, that constant giving is proof of commitment, and that peace is something earned only after suffering. They justify neglect as emotional complexity, silence as depth, and inconsistency as vulnerability. In doing so, they slowly trade their joy for the illusion of connection. The empath's heart becomes a battlefield between their compassion and their boundaries, and compassion usually wins. But without boundaries, even compassion becomes destructive. It begins to erode self-worth, convincing them that the more they give, the more valuable they are. This belief system keeps the empath stuck in cycles of one-sided giving. They absorb emotional pain like it's their purpose, trying to heal others while ignoring their own wounds. But healing someone who refuses to meet you halfway isn't love, it's self-sacrifice. The empath often mistakes their pain for proof that the relationship matters. They tell themselves that the struggle means it's real, that their endurance is noble, that understanding someone's trauma excuses their behavior. In reality, their empathy has become a shield against truth. They use it to rationalize mistreatment because facing the truth would mean acknowledging how deeply they've betrayed their own needs. When the empath finally begins to set boundaries, everything changes. The first no feels heavy, almost cruel. The silence after refusing to fix things feels unnatural. But slowly, they begin to realize that boundaries aren't barriers, they're bridges back to themselves. A boundary doesn't close the heart, it protects it from being drained dry. The empath learns that love doesn't require self-destruction. It requires presence, honesty, and mutual respect. True empathy has space for both people. It doesn't demand that one person disappear to make the other comfortable. The avoidant, accustomed to unlimited emotional access, may react with confusion or even anger when boundaries appear. They interpret distance as rejection, not realizing it's actually restoration. The empath's newfound limits expose how much of the relationship was sustained by one person's emotional labor. For the first time, the avoidant must confront their own avoidance without the empath cushioning the discomfort. The dynamic shifts because the empath is no longer feeding the imbalance that once defined the connection. This transition isn't easy. The empath will question themselves, feel guilt, and worry that they've become cold. But slowly, they'll see that boundaries don't diminish empathy. They deepen it. By protecting their energy, they can give from abundance instead of depletion. They can offer understanding without absorbing pain. And most importantly, they can love without losing themselves. What once was a pattern of survival becomes a practice of self-respect. Love stops being something they earn through sacrifice and becomes something they experience through balance. When empathy is guided by boundaries, it ceases to be self-destruction and becomes its purest form, compassion rooted in strength, not fear. When the empath finally stops giving endlessly, something profound begins to happen inside the avoidant. For the first time, they can no longer depend on the familiar rhythm of pursuit and retreat that has defined their sense of emotional safety. The empath's consistent reassurance, patience, and warmth once acted as a buffer against the avoidant's deepest fear. The fear of emotional exposure. The avoidant has always needed closeness, but on their own terms. They crave connection yet are terrified of being consumed by it. Their distance is not indifference, it is protection. But when the empath withdraws that steady stream of emotional nourishment, the avoidant loses the shelter that allowed them to hide from their own vulnerability. At first, the avoidant may not even notice the shift. They might assume it's temporary, a reaction that will fade as it always has. In the past, when they pulled away, the empath would eventually reach out, apologize, or initiate reconciliation. It was predictable. It was safe. The avoidant could maintain control without risking true intimacy. But now, the silence lingers. The empath's energy doesn't return. The messages don't come. The warmth that once surrounded them feels replaced by an unfamiliar stillness. What once felt comforting, the space and distance, begins to feel like emptiness. That emptiness is not new, it's simply unmasked. The avoidant has spent their life running from it, using emotional withdrawal as a way to feel powerful in relationships. But the empath's detachment exposes the truth: the power was never real. It was borrowed from the empath's willingness to keep giving. Without that dynamic, the avoidant is left face to face with their own fragility. They begin to realize how dependent they've been on the very connection they claimed not to need. The detachment triggers discomfort so intense it borders on panic. It forces the avoidant to confront questions they've avoided for years. Why does closeness scare me? Why do I run? Why do I only want love when it feels like it's slipping away? This exposure is what makes detachment such a powerful shift. It doesn't destroy the avoidant, it reveals them. When they can no longer manipulate emotional distance as a defense mechanism, they have no choice but to feel the vulnerability they've suppressed. The very traits they once dismissed in the empath, sensitivity, openness, emotional honesty, suddenly become qualities they crave. They remember how it felt to be seen without judgment, to be accepted without condition. But now that reflection of safety is gone. The empath's absence magnifies everything the avoidant has refused to acknowledge: their loneliness, their insecurity, and the reality that control is not connection. The empath, meanwhile, is no longer trying to hold space for two people's emotions. They are reclaiming their energy, redirecting it inward, and rediscovering their own emotional independence. The avoidant senses this change not just as distance, but as loss. The emotional dependency they once masked as detachment starts to surface. They may reach out, test boundaries, or attempt to re-engage, not out of love at first, but out of confusion, the sudden awareness that their power no longer works. The dynamic has shifted, and the avoidant is left feeling powerless for perhaps the first time. What the avoidant doesn't realize is that this moment, as uncomfortable as it feels, holds the possibility of growth. Being confronted with one's own emotional avoidance can be the catalyst for transformation, but only if they're willing to face it honestly. Many will resist, retreating further into the safety of detachment. Others, however, will begin to see the pattern for what it is: a defense built on fear, not strength. They may start to understand that intimacy is not suffocation, that love is not loss of self, and that the vulnerability they fear is the very thing that makes connection real. The empath's detachment doesn't punish the avoidant, it liberates both. It frees the empath from the burden of over-giving and forces the avoidant to confront the emptiness beneath their avoidance. In that mirror of absence, the avoidant can finally see themselves clearly, not as cold or indifferent, but as someone who has been protecting a wounded part of themselves for far too long. It's a confrontation that can feel like breaking, but often it's the first step toward healing. The moment the empath finally detaches emotionally, something profound shifts inside them. What once felt like loss begins to feel like freedom. For the first time, they are no longer walking on emotional eggshells, no longer trying to decode silence, no longer chasing crumbs of affection that were meant to keep them hooked. The detachment doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow awakening that begins with exhaustion and ends in clarity. After so many cycles of over-giving, explaining, and proving their worth, the empath reaches a point where peace becomes more valuable than connection. The absence of chaos feels like a strange kind of calm at first, but soon it becomes addictive. The kind of quiet that feels like coming home to oneself. The avoidant often believes they hold the power in the relationship because they are the one who can withdraw without explanation. They rely on the empath's emotional investment to maintain that illusion. But when the empath detaches, the balance of energy shifts completely. The avoidant, who once found safety in emotional distance, begins to feel uneasy. The silence that used to comfort them now feels heavy, almost haunting. They start to wonder if they've gone too far, if the connection they thought they could control has slipped beyond their reach. This is where emotional freedom becomes visible, not as an act of retaliation, but as a declaration of self-worth. For the empath, emotional freedom isn't about indifference, it's about choosing where their energy goes. It's realizing that love cannot thrive in a place where one person is constantly emptying themselves to fill another. It's understanding that love given out of fear, fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough, is not love at all, it's attachment. True love doesn't demand self-erasure. It asks for balance, respect, and reciprocity. When the empath finally steps back, they're not trying to hurt the avoidant, they're finally choosing themselves. They're learning that peace isn't something that needs to be earned. It's something that already belongs to them once they stop fighting for someone else's approval. The avoidant may react with confusion or even panic. The sudden change in dynamic exposes their own dependency, a truth they've long denied. They might reach out, testing whether the empath's silence is permanent. But the empath's response is different now. They are no longer motivated by fear or longing. They can listen without absorbing, observe without reacting, and care without losing themselves in the process. This calm detachment is what real strength looks like, not the hardness of bitterness, but the softness of wisdom. The empath doesn't need to prove anything anymore. They understand that their value was never determined by how much they could endure. Emotional freedom also changes the way the empath sees love itself. They begin to recognize that peace, stability, and mutual understanding are not boring. They are sacred. The high-intensity patterns of chasing and retreating no longer feel like passion. They feel like exhaustion. The empath starts to crave emotional safety over emotional drama, honesty over mystery, and effort over excuses. They no longer romanticize struggle as proof of love. Instead, they see it for what it is, a sign of imbalance. This new perspective transforms how they show up in future connections. They bring empathy, but they also bring boundaries. They can love deeply, but they no longer lose themselves in that love. The avoidant, watching this transformation, begins to feel the absence of the dynamic that once defined the relationship. Their need for control, validation, or emotional distance loses meaning when the empath no longer participates. The detachment forces them to confront their own emotional walls. Walls that once protected them but now only isolate them. Whether they grow from this realization or retreat further into avoidance is beyond the empath's responsibility. The empath's role is no longer to heal, teach, or fix. Their only task now is to remain grounded in their peace. In this stillness, emotional freedom reveals itself as the real victory. It's not about who misses who or who reaches out first. It's about who can stand in their truth without collapsing under it. The empath, once bound by the weight of constant giving, learns to breathe again. They understand that love that costs them their peace is too expensive to keep. They finally know that the power wasn't in being understood by the avoidant. It was in understanding themselves. When the empath finally detaches, everything that once felt confusing starts to make sense. The chaos settles, the patterns reveal themselves, and what once felt like love is seen for what it truly was, an unbalanced exchange of energy. The avoidant, who once seemed so strong in their distance, begins to unravel under the weight of their own silence. And the empath, who once felt powerless, rises not in anger but in peace. That is the quiet irony of emotional detachment. It's not the end of love, it's the beginning of self-respect. This journey isn't about proving who cared more or who lost control. It's about learning that love, to be real, must be mutual. The empath learns that giving endlessly is not love if it means losing themselves. The avoidant learns that control isn't safety if it means being alone inside their own walls. Both, in their own ways, are teachers to each other. One teaches depth, the other teaches boundaries. But the lesson that remains after all the pain is simple: love cannot breathe where fear lives, and connection cannot grow where one person is always running while the other is always reaching. Emotional detachment is not bitterness, it's clarity. It's the moment the empath understands that peace is not found in someone else's approval, but in their own acceptance. It's when they no longer chase closure because they've already given it to themselves. They start to live lighter, speak softer, and move forward without resentment. The avoidant may feel the loss, but the empath feels freedom, the freedom to love again, this time with balance, with awareness, and with both feet planted firmly in self-worth. So, if you've ever been the one who gave too much, who stayed too long, who tried too hard, understand this: your empathy was never the problem. It was your lack of boundaries around it. Protecting your peace doesn't make you cold, it makes you wise. Walking away doesn't mean you stop caring, it means you finally started caring for yourself. That's not weakness. That's strength in its purest form. And as this chapter closes, remember, the empath doesn't walk away to punish the avoidant. They walk away to return home to the self they abandoned in the name of love. That is where real healing begins, and where authentic love will one day find them again, no longer as a lesson, but as peace. Thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for showing up for yourself through these words. If this message stirred something in you, let it be a reminder that your love, when balanced with self-respect, is your greatest power. Take it with you, protect it, and never forget, the right connection will never require you to lose yourself to keep it. Thank you truly for being here. Take care of your heart, stay kind, stay grounded, and most of all, stay free.